Good morning and welcome to Thought for the Day. And I'm going to start by giving you something to have a giggle at. Here's a photograph of me taken about 30 years ago, holding a very enormous quilt. And it's the quilt I'm going to tell you about today. Well, 30 years ago, I was privileged to spend a very short time in Vietnam, not America, as you might think from the quilt, and able to see work of Christians who were having an extremely difficult time because of persecution. To be a Christian was bad enough. To lead a church often ended you up in prison. I won't go into the details of how I came to be there, but just tell you about the quilt project. It's all about a lady called Mai. Mai, when I met her, was in her 60s. And she was a tiny little lady who had a beaming smile. But this is her story. In 1975, Mai and her family were able to escape from the very last plane from Vietnam before the country or the South fell 2 days later. She went first of all to France and then to America for about 10 years. But while she was away, all she and her husband really wanted to do was to get back to Vietnam. Her husband was a Christian pastor, and they just both knew that there was work for them to do there. But while they were in America, Mai went for something to do, to classes to learn to make American quilts. There you are, you got the connection. And she hated it. Well, hate's probably too strong, but she didn't enjoy it, she told us. She couldn't see the point of what she was doing. But when they got back to Vietnam, one day she thought, I know why I've learnt to do those quilts. She had been looking for a project to help some of the street children, of which there are far, far too many in Vietnam, and came up with this idea. She rented a room in a school, hired a couple of treadle sewing machines, and collected about a dozen teenage girls who would have otherwise been on the street and quite likely heading for prostitution or drug addiction if they weren't already in it. She taught them how to make these American quilts. And that's the project that we saw when we went. We went from our touristy backpackers hotel into the very, very poor part of Ho Chi Minh City, where the streets were barely made up, very, very crowded, shops only selling what the local people needed, no touristy tack and so on. And went to the school, into this room, and saw Mai and about a dozen girls. 2 were sat at the sewing machines, the rest were sat on the floor with quilts over their knees, sort of lifted off the ground and off their knees a bit on sort of plastic milk crates. Partly, I think, to take the weight and partly because of the intense heat in the room. So Mai had collected up these girls. She was able to pay them a very small amount, but that small amount paid for them to go to school for half the day, and then they spent the rest of the day with her, gave them money to take home to their families, and as well as teaching them how to make the quilts, she taught them how to budget, how to look after their health. And yeah, she slipped in some stories about Jesus as well. The girls clearly loved Mai. In fact, they called her Mother Mai. And I don't know what happened to them since. It was a small project, but it did have a huge impact on the lives of those girls. I'll come back to that in a minute. What happened to the quilts then, you might be asking? Well, anybody like us who visited was persuaded to take back as many quilts as we could carry and sell them, tell their story, and send the money back to Vietnam. And so we, between us, I think, brought about 4 quilts home, crammed into our cases, and I sold them. And for several years went round to churches and other places talking about my whole visit to Vietnam and the quilt project and taking orders. And we were able to send quite a bit of money back to Vietnam. And that was great. So this very small project, just for a small number of girls, and she would have expanded it if she'd had more money to do it, but it had a huge impact on them. Did any of them become Christians? I don't know. Were their lives changed for the better? Most definitely. Were they being kept off the streets? Yep, for sure. Well, that was just one of my very brief glimpse of one of my special memories of a very special trip, which I believe also changed my life for the better. Not just seeing a different culture, especially of the non-tourist variety, but being challenged by the way Maya and her husband, as well as the girls she was helping, were coping with far greater hardship than I'd ever had, in fact I've never had up until now. I found myself thinking about Mai recently, and can't help comparing her tenacity and resilience, her determination and her love of life, as well as love of God, with how easily I can get pulled down, particularly as lockdown goes on and on. So my prayer for today is for tenacity and resilience, determination and love of life, and to take every opportunity to help our fellow human beings, whether they be close neighbours or those in far-off countries such as Vietnam. Thank you for listening. Oh, and if you are interested in hearing any more about the trip, I kept a diary. Goodbye.